You're listening to a Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.
Welcome to the CraftsmanOnLine podcast. This is a weekly program focused on the relevant topics in Freemasonry and the various aspects of the craft. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmenOnLine.com. Thanks for joining us for this episode as we discuss penalties and obligations. As within each Masonic degree, Freemasons take an obligation, a binding promise between Masons, their brethren, and their lodge. Also included are unique symbolic penalties in each degree. Brother John Nagy returns to join our discussion on the significance of the ties that bind our gentle craft. Welcome back to the podcast, Brother John.
Thanks again for having me, Brother Michael.
Now, to borrow your line, this is a Brother John line. If you came to this podcast looking for Masonic secrets, you will find none here. I've always loved that from you. The ritual that we're going to be referencing throughout the episode, you can find it. We've talked about this before. Duncan's Ritual. It's been widely published for many years and is available to purchase from many sources. And we don't really have to point you where to find it because it's out there. But I think at a certain point in the ritual, we know as candidates who have gone through, we get to that altar, we take a solemn obligation. And I think one of the questions we have is, first of all, a lot of Old English is used at that part, but what are we obligating ourselves to do, I think is basically what starts on that entered apprentice level.
Well, every single obligation that you ever take in the Blue Lodge or Symbolic with the first 3 degrees, all the obligations are basically saying the same thing. You're going to be a morally better man. Going to make sure that you don't share anything that ruins the experience for anybody else. And last but not least, support your brothers at this level and below. That's the gist of all the obligations.
Now, I know those that are checking in that are like, whoa, you're talking about penalties and obligation. Oh, you're already violating one of the obligations that you would not talk about this or write this down or stamp or stain it or any of those other things. But you and I have had this discussion. I think there's symbolically, yes, that would apply. But there's also your definition of, to me, at least what a secret is. And I would agree that the modes of recognition, the passwords, the handshakes, those are the secrets. But into the deeper part of it, when you talk about some of the real experiences that you could only get going through our degree process, I think those are honestly the real secrets that are left in Masonry.
Okay.
Where are you on that?
Well, I don't speak about what goes on in my ritual with anybody other than my brothers who are within the state of Florida and recognized throughout the entire world. But when I am on podcasts like this, I'm talking about rituals in general that are shared universally throughout the entire world, whether you happen to be recognized, clandestine, unrecognized, irregular, makes no difference. The basic script is the same, and it is available anywhere that you look on the internet that you know what to look for. It's going to be there. So as I understand the secrets in practice, it is, as you had stated, the modes of recognition, signs and grips and what have you, words. And we don't talk about the specifics of that with anybody who is not at the level that we are talking at.
Right.
Other than that, we're just talking about Blue Lodge experience and some of the literature that's been published throughout the entire world for the last 300 plus years.
That's the fun part, though. This isn't a conversation or material that isn't widely been out there or discussed or revealed in any way. And also to that point, our obligation, yes, is what makes us Masons. But I think all of us that have gathered around that altar and taken that step, we may have wondered, where did the origins of the obligation come about? How did they evolve from what is now our practice ritual?
Well, if you're talking about Freemasonic ritual obligations, they evolved over time. They were borrowed, quite blatantly borrowed from the original stonecraft, not even guilds, the stonecraft professionals of years past prior to the formation of Freemasonry in and around the Grand Lodge era of 1717-ish. They went back, they combed through all the literature, all the documents, all the manuscripts, and they said, we got to put something together that is going to grab the attention of the individuals who want to have an authentic experience. So they put together a script and they planned and plotted and schemed. They even had the write up, which is now referred to as Anderson's Constitutions, which actually he gets credit for it, but there was a whole bunch of people involved. Again, combing through old manuscripts, putting it together. But what's really interesting is if you look at what was actually written, there's some really neat, morally significant things written within the manuscript. But the drinking songs at the end, the 11 pages of a drinking songs at the end, kind of gives you a little flavor as to what that whole thing was targeted toward. It's a enlightening, entertaining experience with brothers, and they put together a beautiful constitution to kind of solidify what they were doing and legitimize it. But it was all borrowed originally from the manuscripts of years past. So when you talk about the obligations, they came from the old manuscripts, and they adjusted and tweaked and kept them pretty well solid over the years from one jurisdiction to the next. And you see minor differences in some of the ways, some of the things that are promised and obligated toward.
It's one of those things where I wish that I could hop in Doc Brown's time machine and travel back to the 1700s when the language that was spoken then would have been more familiar than to what now have become modern today's Masons, where we're like, this old English, we're like, what did I just say? What did I mean? It sounds very similar to other oaths that I may have had to take at some point in my life, but an obligation is different. We're going to get to that in a little bit. Is there a particular part of our obligation that was meaningful to you? For me, probably one of the lines that I have had, it's been transformative to me, is the part where we talk about our relationship with brothers that are in need and coming to their assistance and being there supportively for them. And I'm again paraphrasing this because it's really maybe a sentence and a half. But to me, the deeper meanings that's in there speak to the principal tenets of Masonry, brotherhood, and charity especially.
Out of all the things that I said with my hand on that book, on the altar, all three times, the most significant phrase that grabs my heart every time I hear it in others being said, and unfortunately, I don't think they understand the significance of it. So help me God.
Mm.
It is such an unbelievably beautiful request to our God, the great architect of the universe, the creator, our master. Here I am on the altar along with every other brother that's gone through the obligation, and I'm making a request for God to help me in what it is that I have undertaken. So many people misunderstand what that means. It says, so therefore, God, help me in what it is that I have just undertaken.
Mm.
And a lot of people, brothers especially, they hear it and they don't understand that it is a request to God to assist the person who is putting forth this obligation on their shoulders, committing to taking up their cross and carrying a specific series of burdens and asking for God's help, and summarily turning around and saying, if I'm true to my word, God help me. And if I'm not true to my word, then I understand why you're not helping me.
Very powerful point, and leads right into the difference between a pledge, an oath, an obligation, because at that time, once you take the obligation on the first degree, congratulations, bang, you're a brother Mason. But in that moment, you're hearing these words. They sound important. They sound significant. You're told to repeat them back. You're stating all of this. I do think it's really powerful how you point that out, that at the very end, you're like, what did I just get myself into? But then later, when you have a chance to kind of reflect after that evening, when now you're a Mason, you can say, yeah, I'm supposed to be doing this, but I'm not supposed to be doing this alone.
Well, with God's help, we take on the burden and we accomplish it. And a lot of people, when they hear obligation, particularly individuals who are trying to persuade brothers to not be involved in Freemasonry, they say, oh, that's an oath, or you're swearing. No, it's called an obligation, and it's called an obligation for a specific reason. The reason is because you are obligating yourself to become a moral man and be supportive of your brothers. And if that isn't an obligation, I don't know what is. Now, in the obligation, there are precursors and postcursors that have indications of swearing and oathing. And keep in mind that when you swear, you're making a promise. When you vow, you're making a solemn promise. And when you take an oath, you are also taking a solemn promise. If anybody here has ever gotten married at least once, you take a vow, which is an oath. You take a vow and an oath to the other party that you will meet specific guidelines in being poor, being rich, health, the whole bit, and not health, sickness. And you are taking on a particular role in another person's life when it happens to be a wedding vow. And you're doing that in the presence of family, witnesses, and even God. You're doing that in the presence. And when you take an obligation at an altar with your hand on a book that's supposed to be sacred to you, supposed to represent what's etched in your heart, and you take on a bunch of obligations and you promise to adhere to those guidelines. But you're not making a promise to your brothers. You're not making a promise to God. You're making a promise. And therein lies the kicker, is you're not making that promise to anyone other than yourself. And you are beholden to only yourself. And God will help you do that. It's like when I'm coaching people and my clients, I tell them before they even come on board with me, I cannot hold you accountable for anything. And I refuse to get involved in that insanity. However, if you empower me, I will help you hold yourself accountable to yourself. And as long as you empower me, I'll help you keep track of what it is that you promised to do for yourself. But the moment that you disempower me, no longer empower me to help you hold yourself accountable, the first thing I'm going to throw in your face, real hardcore, and put you up against the wall, breathing down your throat, I'm going to say, oh, so you don't want to be held accountable anymore here.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just going to spell it out. You either want to be held accountable or you don't. It's not a game. I won't play a game. And if they want to play a game, they can play it alone. And the same thing has to do with an obligation. I'm asking God to help me. And the same thing goes with the accountability with God. He's not going to punish me. I do that to myself. He's not going to hold me accountable. He can help me hold myself accountable. But if I am not true to my word, and if my heart's not in it, and I'm being torn in two different directions, well, the punishment is the fact that I'm not true to my word. The punishment is that I don't have my heart in what I'm doing. And the punishment is I'm going to be pulled in two different directions. That is the punishment. And so many people think, oh no, they're going to rip your heart out, or going to rip your tongue out, or they're going to cut you in half and pull you into. No, you do it to yourself. You don't need anybody's help. Just do not give your word and keep it one time and see what the consequences are for not only yourself, but the people that you gave your word to.
Right. And that's the thing. What good is a promise if there's not a penalty on the backside. And that's the interesting part, is you're sitting there going through these degrees, and usually by the third degree, you've figured out the pattern, you get what's going on here. But the one thing that changes is the penalty of the degree. And to this, I would turn to Mackey's Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, where he writes, the Masonic obligation is a moral one, which, although it cannot be enforced by the courts of law, is binding on the party who makes it in conscience and according to moral justice. And I think you put that in a beautiful way, because in certain jurisdictions, we hold ourselves to a symbolic penalty, which exists of probably the most gruesome punishment that could ever be given to you. When you hear this, you're like, what? And for me, I got a little nervous, because I'm like, if I say something to the wrong person or write something down that I'm not supposed to, are they literally going to rip out my tongue? Is that really what's going to happen to me? And you hear the stories, and so explain these symbolic penalties, where they came from, and how they ended up in our ritual.
Let's rewind before we get into that. We're not making an oath to anyone. If you listen to the words of the obligation, an oath is a promise in the presence of people. They are witness. Therefore, if we violate our obligation, we're violating ourselves. No one witnesses my obligation or any other obligation is beholden to take any action whatsoever other than to take care of themselves. Meaning that if the person obligated themselves in front of me, they promised that they would do specific things, and their word was found to be no good, I'm going to take care of myself. Am I going to believe their tongue from that point on? Of course, I'm not going to believe their tongue from that on. They've already proven that their word is no good. Their tongue is absolutely useless. You know, they say they're going to do something and their heart's not in it. I'm not willing to give them a second chance, because I've already seen the damage that they do when their heart's not in the work that I've asked them to do. And if they're being pulled in two different directions, they're not there. They're literally elsewhere, because they're being pulled in two different directions. Am I going to want to participate with them in any endeavors into the future when I realize they're not really there? Of course not. So I will take care of myself. And the penalty for the person who's violating their obligation is exclusion. People are not going to include them. People are not going to believe them. People are not even going to want to give them an opportunity, because they've already proven to themselves they're not trustworthy. So when we're talking about these penalties, these gruesome, I'm talking about bloodthirsty, all the stuff that you hear, the zealots claiming that, these oaths are blood oaths and all. Well, first of all, if you understand the basis of what's being said, there's a promise being made to oneself to be a more moral man. You're asking God not only to witness that promise and your brothers to witness that promise, but you're asking God to help you stay true to your word. And these obligations include penalties. And one of the most disappointing things that I have an experience for is when I hear the phrase, oh, they're only symbolic. Well, I'm sorry, symbolism is about one thing representing another.
Well, I often think that we use the symbolic thing for guys like me, where I immediately looked over at my Masonic mentor and, was like, when I was learning this part of the catechism, and was like, and he's like, no, we're not going to show up to your house and throw you in the back of a van and do this to you. But we don't do that. And I think and I'm hoping he was joking. We don't do that anymore. Wait. But I always thought about it in a sense of like, there had to be a vivid picture of what it would feel like to betray yourself and others that trusted you to be a moral person, virtuous person, if you failed at one of the obligations. But the way that you have described it, I have really sat back and thought about that more beautifully, that who really is the one person that can hurt you the most, that it's the most painful thing in life is when you let yourself down. Like, no one's going to beat you up more than you are, literally.
If you are a person of conscience and you take these things to heart, you realize that the punishment, the symbolic punishments as described are really what goes on for you internally. You realize that once your word is no good, your tongue may not, I mean, might as well not be there anymore. I mean, it's useless.
Right.
And you realize that the more that you try to speak and gain people's trust again, it's an uphill battle. I mean, you have to painstakingly build your reputation and your word back. That in itself, I mean, it would be easier to have your tongue removed because then you'd have an excuse. But the fact of the matter is, it's there flopping around in your mouth. It might as well be flopping in the wind because people aren't going to listen to you. In fact, they're more likely not to listen to you than anything else. Anything that you say, they'll probably take it just the opposite because they've realized from your track record, you can't be trusted. And, so far and so forth with the other penalties, when you realize that your word's no good and your heart's not in it, you're being torn in two different directions with your mind and your heart are telling you two different things, people pick up on this stuff. And the punishment isn't what is symbolized in what is spelled out in the actual penalties. They represent something very significant to a person's life. And if you realize that when you hear that term only symbolic, it often softens the blow for people who don't understand the relevance of, I'm sorry, if you see a bottle and it has the skull and crossbones on the bottle, it symbolically is telling you it's poison, right? And okay, so, but it's only symbolic, so it's only symbolic. It's just a symbol telling you that it's poison, but it's only symbolic. And the significance in these penalties are, it's only symbolic, but these are things that people don't do to you. You do them to yourself. You literally, they're self-inflicted. And as a result, in the obligation, they have these penalties that are very graphic.
Yes.
And they're supposed to drive home a point. Yes, they're symbolic. Yes, if you have any gray matter between your ears, you're going to understand that only symbolic means that, they don't specifically happen to you literally, but they darn sure well will happen to you figuratively. And it's far worse than the literal explanation.
Right. Well, and the other part of it is I'm starting to make connections here to some of the deeper meanings, I would say, to these penalties. So starting at the first degree, where as an entered apprentice, you're basically youth. You're trying to part ways with the childish, youngish things in your life to be able to move to that next middle part of your years, right? And what's one of the problems that kids tend to have? They don't know when not to tell somebody something. Anyone who's had children knows how many times you have to go through a rehearsal before you bring them into a situation of what to and not to say. So when you think about the penalty of that first degree, as you said, if you speak loosely, no one will trust any words you have to say. What's the point of being able to speak at all? So then I thought about the second one, which is for those of us that have made that jump from youth to middle age, you begin to consider, some of the top 5 most memorable things in my life. One of them was the day that I was raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason. Now, there's another list that I have that I don't like to think about that because it's the top 5 things where I really screwed up big time in life. And I can tell you, just thinking about those moments sends cold chills from the back of my heels all the way up to the back of my ears on the backside of my body. And it feels like I had my heart torn out of my chest, and not in a pleasant way,
And you
and had to
relive
sit
that
there and watch it happen.
and
Yeah.
you relive it every single
Yeah.
time the memory comes up as a stern warning of what happens when your heart is not in it.
Yeah.
So let's go back to your question about where they come from. I'll give you some hints. The being torn in two different directions does come from scripture, where they, let's put it this way, there's an echo of it in scripture. Now, if you want to say it came from there, I shouldn't go that far. However, if you look at scripture, there's a particular point where a promise is being made and animals were severed in twain and they walked between the two of them. If you look at the aspect of the heart, if you go to specific ancient Greek literature, like Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, you will actually hear somebody say in two different parts of the writing about, if I'm not telling the truth, let my heart be pulled out and, fed to the fowls. So I'm listening to this. I'm saying to myself, gee, that sounds awful familiar. And it's coming right out of Greek literature. And I suspect the aspect of the tongue has to do with some of the penalties that were played out during the Middle Ages when people were not their word. I'm not too sure about that one. I do know that I think it's Proverbs 10:31 where it talks about if you're not your word. It doesn't say we should remove the offending organ, but it does say that one should be silenced if one's word is not true. And I'm paraphrasing. So you've got a lot of different hints throughout early literatures, ancient Greece, the scriptures, and of course the Middle Ages, that you have varying places where they could have been grabbed from and inserted into ritual. When you
Well, I
see,
think as we also work our way to that third degree, now we've made a better relationship with ourselves in the first degree. We're making a better relationship with our lodge brothers in the second degree. By the time we get to the third degree, now we're talking about larger contexts of things. So community, we're definitely there with deity, with friends, family. We've extended things to certain folks. And I've thought about that too. Times when I have had to, sometimes it would be those little white lies, oh, this isn't going to hurt anybody, but or other times where you literally betray to somebody and you were two different people at the same time. And I always say, what's the penalty for liars? And the answer I give is that they have to live the lie. And there's nothing more painful when you are living that lie and you're trying to be one version of yourself when you have this other alternate version of yourself there too.
it's exhausting
It is extremely exhausting.
and it's stressful. And you spin your wheels and you have your engine going at full peak because you don't want to be discovered for the liar you are.
Yeah, it's painful. So we've got these very powerful penalties that are attached at the end of the obligation. The good news is, as Brother John has pointed out, and I think this is like a great point to just kind of revisit again as we close out this discussion, is that you are not alone when it comes to staying true to your obligation, to the words that you spoke. We've got the working tools. We, of course, have our lodge brothers, and we have the relationship with deity, with God, whoever that supreme being in your life may be. I never really thought of it that way. Always kind of thought of it as you're alone out in, the wilderness or in the desert trying to make your way back. I guess in a sense is that, the obligation it's very serious, it's very solemn, and the penalty at the very end is eye-opening, and you're like, okay, if I don't do these things, bad thing is going to happen to me. But I like the fact that you work back in that there is a higher power than ourselves that we can reach out to for support past ourselves, our lodge brothers, and the working tools that we're given in Freemasonry of those lessons.
The formula is real simple. You start out by basically saying, I'm doing this freely in the presence of my brothers and in the presence of God. And what I promise to do is X, Y, and Z. And they're all things that I should be doing in my life anyway when it comes to family, friends, brothers, whatever. And I will take these things into consideration, which basically says I will be moral. I will be better at what it is that I try to do in my life. I will support my brothers in their efforts as well in their life activities. And oh, by the way, I'm not going to spoil it for anybody else who's coming through, and they'll just hear it when they hear it. And by the way, I realize that if I'm not my word, if my heart's not in it, or if I'm disconnecting my heart from my head, I realize that those three things have consequences for them that I visit upon myself, and I'm fully aware of those consequences. And as a result of being aware of this, I'm still willing to take on these burdens, this cross that I'm wanting to carry, becoming a better individual. And I have one fallback, and that is that as I'm making effort to do all this and much, much more, I'm asking God for God's help in making sure that I stay true to what it is that I'm attempting to accomplish. It's pretty straightforward, no matter how you want to cut it, no pun intended.
And I think for future brothers that I get the privilege of working with through their catechism, I'm going to use that explanation more, lean on that more than the scary monsters that are in the closet that'll come and get you at night if you break your word.
There's a lot of myths around these penalties, and unfortunately, ignorance reigns supreme when it comes to them. We have a lot of individuals who have never gone through the obligations, and a few who have absolutely different interests than what is best for the individuals going through. And they use a lot of scare tactics. And they use the Morgan affair as one example of, some of the horrendous things that Masons do. And the fact of the matter is, brothers don't have to do anything to an individual who violates their obligation. The individual who violates their obligation is self-imposed. And if anything, brothers will help get that brother back on track more than try to make them suffer for what it is they've done. They will give them second chances depending on what happened, and they will do whatever they can to support the brothers in getting back into that obligatory state, rather than, well, okay, let's get out the knives. Brothers don't do that. It's like what I was talking with you about last time about the eye for an eye. You yourself, if you're harmed or you suffer a violation, the last thing you want to do is suffer that. And if you truly don't want to suffer that, if you have any conscience whatsoever, you don't want somebody else to suffer that, because you know what it feels like. So what you try to do is you try to make amends, and you try to get back on track and repair whatever can be repaired, and be civil, respectful, and considerate with not only yourself, but other human beings. So the penalties are no different than that eye for an eye. You're going to suffer by your own hand, and brothers are going to basically pat you on the back, and they're going to say, yeah, I was a dumb butt too at one time. Let me tell you what I did. They commiserate because everybody has some sort of flaw, and everybody drops the ball at some time. So what are you going to do? Continuously remind them? Or are you going to say, hey, all right, you're screwed up. What do you got to do differently this next time? Or what do you have to do to repair this, make amends? Let's get back on track.
Always love having this guy, our guest this week. Brother John Nagy, thanks for coming back, Brother John.
Thank you once again, Brother Michael. It's always an honor, a privilege, and darn fun getting together with you.
After a long day, I always look forward to our time together. And for our listener, I'll give you the heads up. The next time we talk to Brother John, it's worth doing a little homework. If you've wondered what the heck a hecatomb is, do your research so that you can really enjoy our next conversation with Brother John in 2 weeks on the CraftsmanOnLine podcast. Incidentally, if you've enjoyed this episode, it's really easy to get more. You can just say, hey Siri, or hey Alexa, play Craftsman Online podcast. Yeah, we're available on just about every streaming platform that's out there with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.
You've been listening to A Brother Asks and Building Better Builders video education series production.